One has a PhD in philosophy, has several books written, and tons of debates under his belt. The other has no credentials to speak of, has no book written, and only 2 debates on YouTube under his belt. One shall stand, and one shall fall. Who can win this ultimate showdown of ultimate destiny? Start the logical fallacy counter. It's Deconverted Man versus William Lane Craig.
So I want to do a quick intro here before I begin this video series. I am beginning this video series now in this particular video. Everyone got that? Okay, but at any rate, this is an intro to explain the video series that you're now actually watching. You know what? I better just get on with it. I'd like to thank Kizzume Flowers for the wonderful intro, and while I'm mispronouncing names, I'd also like to blame Rictus for this particular video, and if you think that this is way too long of an analysis, please join me in blaming Rictus. No, I'm just kidding. I appreciate Rictus and I appreciate Kizzume. I think they're both wonderful people. I think one is more handsome than the other, but I'm not going to tell you who that is. They can both assume that it's them. Actually, there's only one man on YouTube who I think is the most handsome man on YouTube, and that person will remain anonymous. Deconverted Man. So this particular video is the 10 worst objections to the Kalam cosmological argument. WLC, William Lane Craig, I'm just going to call him WLC from now on, loves this argument. If this argument was a human being, I think he would marry it and make sweet, sweet love to it. He just is obsessed with this argument. He is convinced that this argument is logically sound, and he defends it every single time he gets a chance. Even when it doesn't even make sense to do so, he'll try to mention it and bring it in. I mean, he just loves this argument to death. He is obsessed with it, as I said. And it's so bizarre because I feel like WLC understands logic to some extent. I've heard him explain logic. He even explains some logic in this video. And then he goes on to perform the very fallacies that he just explained that we shouldn't do. So that boggles my mind. I don't understand how somebody can sort of understand logic and or present what logic is and then make a logically incoherent argument. I don't know, but WLC is an expert at doing it. He is a huge, huge name in Christian apologetics, and you can't get away from this guy, so you have to do a video about him if you're a skeptic. It's just an unwritten rule, and I would show you where it was written, but again, it's not written. Although someone could write it, and then it would be a written rule, but it's still, well, anyways, it wouldn't be official, but whatever. Look, I'm just going to do this. So he presents these 10 objections. I'm going to talk about these 10 objections and analyze what he has said for logical fallacies. In this particular video, I will not be doing that because the first objection is not one that I can analyze for logical fallacies. Alright, on to the video.
Objection number 1. Craig says that he believes in God on the basis of the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit in his heart, not on the basis of the Kalam cosmological argument. In fact, he says that even if the argument were refuted, he would still believe in God. This is blatant hypocrisy on Craig's part. Response to objection number 1. The problem with this objection is that even if I were a hypocrite, there's just no relationship between the soundness of an argument and the psychological state of the person propounding it. The objector is thus guilty of putting forth a textbook example of an argument ad hominem. That is to say, trying to invalidate a position by attacking the character of the person who defends it. So what does make for a sound deductive argument? The answer is true premises and valid logic. True premises and valid logic. An argument is sound if the premises of the argument are true and the conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic. The soundness of the Kalam cosmological argument is thus entirely independent of me. The argument was, after all, defended by the medieval Muslim theologian Al-Ghazali 1,000 years before I was born. If the argument is sound, it was sound then. If the argument is sound, it was sound during the Jurassic period, before anyone had propounded it. My alleged hypocrisy just has nothing to do with the soundness of the argument.
Amazingly enough, I grant everything that Craig has said thus far. He is a hypocrite, but it doesn't matter because the argument is either valid or invalid. Now, he doesn't say either it's valid or invalid. He just says it's sound, and he never says it could ever be unsound. He just says the soundness of it doesn't matter if I am this or not. And he's totally right. I totally agree with him. His mental state is irrelevant. Either he has a logical argument or he doesn't. In this case, he doesn't, but we'll get to that later.
Now, to be a good argument, the argument must admittedly be more than merely sound. If the premises of an argument are true, but we have no evidence for the truth of those premises, then the argument will not be a good one. It may, unbeknownst to us, be sound, but in the absence of any evidence for the premises, it won't, or at least shouldn't, convince anyone. The premises have to have some kind of epistemic warrant for us in order for a sound argument to be a good argument.
And I still find myself in agreement with WLC here. An argument has to have elements of reality in it in order to be a good argument. I would say it's not about being good, because either an argument is logically valid or it's not. It's very binary in that essence. But there is the possibility that a logician must face that an argument could be valid and yet have no evidence in real life about the argument. And Craig would, I think, want to call that a bad argument. Of course, there's no empirical evidence for God, so we're going to have to see if the Kalam holds up to Craig's own standards here.
Now, I've argued that what is needed is that the premises need to be not only true, but more plausible than their opposites, or negations. If it is more plausible that a premise is true in light of the evidence rather than false, then we ought to believe the premise.
Before, I had no problem with the idea of a good argument, because good and bad are something that's in contrast. It's a binary system, which really is what logic is. It's a binary system. Either you have a valid argument or you don't. There aren't degrees there. There isn't something that's more probable or more possible. Not in the way that Craig is suggesting. It just doesn't work that way in logic. And I don't see where this idea would work in any of the formulas that we have in logic. I mean, what would you say? A is more probable than B or C, therefore A is more probably true than B or C? How would that work? It's not something that I see being introduced into logic anytime soon, and it's currently not in logic. So this idea is just being pulled out of thin air by Craig and being inserted as if it is a part of logic when it isn't a part of logic. And when something isn't really true, well, what do we call it? Hello, I'm in the middle of a video. Hey, how's it going? I haven't heard from you for a long, long time. Yeah, I'm back. I'm in this video. Yes, I know. I want to tell you something. Yeah, what do you want to say? I hate you. Okay, I hung up on him again. Anyways, back to the video.
Now, plausibility is, to a certain degree, person relative. Some people may find a premise more plausible than its opposite, while others may not.
Subjective reasoning is probably why we don't have this as an actual thing in logic. Craig's basically admitted that this is a problem. He never deals with it. He just goes on as if it doesn't matter.
In that sense, the goodness of an argument is not wholly independent of people's psychological states.
Then what value does having a good, bad argument have then? Now see, earlier I said I'm fine with that. You know, if you want to say that an argument is good versus an argument being bad, if you're saying that to recognize that an argument has evidence to back the premises, and I want to have some way to say that in a simplistic term, so I'm going to call all arguments that have evidence for some or all of the premises good arguments. And I guess maybe arguments that have evidence for every premise would be great arguments, but the evidence might not be good to other people, so there is a subjectivity to evidence now? Is that how this is really working? So it all boils down to this idea that an argument is either good or bad is one of complete and utter subjectiveness, which in that case, if that's true, we should discard this entire idea of an argument being good or bad and just stick to with what logic already has, which is it's either valid or invalid.
In the case of the Kalam cosmological argument, I do in fact find the premises more plausible than their opposites, and therefore I'm convinced that it is a good argument.
And I'm convinced that it's a bad argument. Oh, well, I guess that's the end of that. I mean, you're convinced it's good, I'm convinced it's bad. We can cross our arms, we can look at each other, and we'll get nowhere. Logic isn't about being convinced that an argument is good or bad. It's about analyzing every premise, scrutinizing those premises to determine whether they are valid or invalid premises on their own, and then whether or not each premise follows the one before it, and what conclusion those premises lead to. That process is not a subjective one. It cannot be a subjective one. And the moment we make it a subjective one is the moment that we can have the sort of presentation that WLC here has, which is, I like this argument, and also it's valid. Well, I don't care if you like it. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant whether you like it or not. If it's valid, it's valid. If it's invalid, it's invalid.
I just don't regard the argument as the basis for my belief in God. And I've been quite candid about that. My belief in God is a properly basic belief grounded in the inner witness of God's Holy Spirit. And I find it odd that rather than being commended for my candor, I'm accused of hypocrisy. I've elsewhere defended the proper basicality of belief in God on the basis of the Spirit's witness, but that's quite unnecessary here, for even if I were entirely mistaken about that, it would have no bearing on the worth of the Kalam cosmological argument.
Is WLC fishing for a compliment here? Is he wanting someone to commend him for his honesty? I'll commend him for his honesty. Okay, WLC, I commend you for your honesty in this particular instance. I think you would be even more honest if you said, yes, I actually am a hypocrite. But, okay, I get it. I mean, it's hard to say that. It's hard to admit that. Yeah, that's fine. And again, you're right. It doesn't matter. Either the argument's valid or it's invalid, and it's completely a separate topic from why you believe in God. But there is a big difference between why you believe something is true and why I would believe something is true. Whereas you just believe it's true because of this inward experience that you have, I would believe something is true because I had a logical argument for it, and or a test for it, and or empirical evidence for it. Usually I put that in reverse order, but nonetheless, those are the reasons why I would think something is true. Versus, you feel like it's true, therefore it's true. So there is a big difference between those two positions.
Similarly, whatever reason I have personally for believing in God, whether it's the witness of the Holy Spirit, or the ontological argument, or the teleological argument, or divine revelation, or whatever, that just has no relation to the soundness or the worth of the Kalam cosmological argument. The skeptic may not like my taking belief in God as properly basic, but that's not a criticism of the Kalam cosmological argument. That's at best a rejection of proper basicality of belief in God, which has simply no bearing on the worth of the Kalam argument.
And again, I agree that the objection to what Craig calls a properly basic belief in God is a separate thing, which is why I think this whole thing is a potential straw man. I don't know if it is an actual straw man or not. somebody could have made an argument to Craig in this way, or it could have been in written format and or in verbal format. I am aware of at least one atheist / skeptic who argued Craig and pointed out where in Reasonable Faith, his book, he talks about why he believes in God, and he objected to this. It was his entire opening argument against Craig. It wasn't against the Kalam, but it was a totally different reason that he was giving that as an opening argument. So that might be what Craig is referring to. I don't know. No examples are given of where these objections appear, so all of these objections are potential straw man. What would make them actual straw man is if we find evidence that they are straw man, that they weren't actually presented at some point. I can't really make that case, so there's just potential straw man. So, having again established the fact that how Craig approaches a belief, or why Craig holds a belief, is completely and totally separate from whether or not the argument is valid or invalid, I want to spend the remainder of this particular video talking about the difference between how Craig approaches a belief and how I approach a belief, because after all, it is Deconverted Man versus William Lane Craig. So let's look at the way we approach beliefs, and you, my audience, can decide which way is better. Or, since that's a little bit vague, which way is logically valid. Okay, so Craig has at least two things that I think that Craig would use as a way to verify God personally. Either divine witness of the Holy Spirit, which is some sort of internal feeling, or divine revelation. Both of those might actually be the same thing as far as Craig is concerned. I'm not really too clear on it. But neither of these things is something that Craig has ever adequately explained how one can know that those things are from the real God. Craig gave an analogy on his website about experiencing God, where you have all these different cups of water, and one of them is actually water, and the rest is water but has arsenic in it, or some other extremely potent poison. And you happen to know that your water is the only clean water. I'm not sure how you know that, but in this particular thought experiment / analogy, you know that that's really water and every other water is poisonous. And so all these other people are drinking water thinking that they have regular water, and they're all in error, where you're fine and you know that you're fine because you had information that they lack. The problem with this analogy is we can test the waters to find out which ones are poisonous and not poisonous. And there is no way to test to see if you have God or not. There is absolutely no test that I'm aware of, at any rate, to perform on, say, a Hindu and a Christian that lets you know, based on their subjective personal experience, who has a real experience from God. There's no test that we could run on this. Craig's analogy just says you know. It doesn't tell you how you know, just you know it's true, you know it's true, you know it's true. You have the clean water. I don't know how you know that you have the clean water, just trust me, you have that clean water. I'm sorry, but from where I come from, as a skeptic, that's not good enough. I need to test that water. And if I don't test that water, I'm not going to drink it, because it might be poisonous. So on the one side, we have Craig's way of approaching things, which is you just believe that you happen to have the actual God. And my way is I require a test to know whether or not I have the actual God. And that's even assuming that there is an actual God that I could have in the first place. I require a test, Craig doesn't. What about the next element? Divine revelation. So God speaks to person X and not person Y. Person X tells person Y that God spoke to them. Person Y says, hey, that's wonderful. I totally believe you, even though you've given me no evidence that this happened. I just am going to believe you. You're a nice guy. I don't see why you would lie to me. All right, I guess I'll worship that God. And then he goes and he tells another person, he's like, hey, I just heard from God, and that person happens to be me, the skeptic, and I'm like, no, I don't believe you. It might have happened, might not have happened. Why don't you have God speak to me? Well, God's telling me that he doesn't want to talk to you right now. I'm sorry. You'll have to try again later. Actually, God's just told me that if you believe in him, he'll talk to you. If he talks to me, then I can believe in him. No, you have to believe in him, then he'll talk to you. Alright, I forced myself to believe somehow. Alright, God's still not talking to me. Oh, you didn't believe hard enough, so God won't talk to you. So divine revelation, again, is something that cannot be empirically verified, cannot be tested. So from a skeptical point, no, these things are not something that can be established. What about logic, though? What does logic have to say about personal experience? It's invalid. It's an invalid thing in logic. Logic says personal experience means nothing. Zero, zip, zilch, doesn't matter. Your own experience is irrelevant. It is not count. So logic agrees with me on this. Okay, so let me explain my way of approaching something for a belief, whether or not I'm going to believe it or be skeptical of it. I need one or more of these things in order to believe something is true, or even possibly true. I need either empirical evidence, a repeatable test, and or a logically coherent argument. If you can't offer me the first or the second, I'm going to be very skeptical about that thing, because there isn't something that I have encountered that is real that lacks empirical evidence and or a repeatable test for it. But I'm willing to think that something could be real and yet lack those things. But that entity, that thing, whatever that is, needs a logical argument to establish it. And so it is that third one that has to be valid for me to investigate further into what you're proposing. If you have an illogical argument, then I get to be skeptical about your conclusions, and so I'm not even going to investigate further into it. It just sounds like a lot of baloney to me. It's a bunch of BS. I'm not going to look into it further. Come back when you have a logical argument, and we'll talk then. And so that approach is scientifically sound, first of all, because requiring empirical evidence and or a repeatable test is scientifically sound. Science has been able to do wonders for society, and science continually produces results, so we can be sure about the methodologies of science. So it's something that we can rely on. It works really well, and it works over and over again. So as a skeptic, also this applies. A skeptic usually requires these things, if not more. My list is small compared to some. My list of requirements is very small compared to some. My demands are less than other skeptic demands might be. There are to me, reasonable limits of skepticism. For other skeptics, there are no limits. It's be skeptical of everything and anything, including, for some, reality itself. I don't go that far. I assume reality is real, and I do so until some evidence and or test is produced to show otherwise. Or at least somebody offers me a logically coherent argument to suggest reality isn't real. Then I'm going to investigate it as best as I'm able and eventually run into some sort of wall where I can't go further in that investigation and just have to go back to assuming that reality is real, and that's the best I can do. This is philosophically sound. Is it logically sound? Well, the logic part obviously is logically sound. Logic is logical. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be logic. What about empirical evidence? Yes, logic says yes to this as a way to establish things. The premise has to be true for logic to function. So how do you know if that premise is true unless you have some sort of evidence for it? And or empirical evidence for it. And I want to use the word empirical evidence rather than just evidence because I think that's more descriptive. So the way to find out if a premise is true is you have empirical evidence for it, or you have a test that can establish it as being true. And so both of these things are things that logic wouldn't have a problem with, and you should double check on that yourself and see whether or not I'm just pulling things out of thin air. Because on the one side you have WLC, who just believes that he has what's true, and on the other side you have me, who says, you know what, I can only believe it if I have empirical evidence and or a repeatable test, and if you don't have those things, I'm going to have a logically coherent argument before I even think that those things are absent for a good reason. And if you don't have that, then those two absences is going to make me think that I should continue to be skeptical of what it is you're trying to present. Let me ask you, my loyal listener who has stuck with me this whole time and enjoyed very little visual content, these questions, these hypothetical sort of thought experiment questions, and please be as honest as you want to be in the comments below on your answers to these questions. So question 1. Who would you rather have as your doctor? Doctor 1 believes that they know how to cure you. Doctor 2 is basing their cures on empirical evidence. Question 2. Would you look outside to decide if it's raining, or just believe me when I tell you that it's raining? Question 3. What is a better way to find out about the world around us? Either believing that something is true, or investigating to find out whether or not it's true. Let me know. I am interested in your answers. As I said in the start, this video won't be an analysis. There was only one logical fallacy, not even enough reason to put up the counter. The only fallacy Craig produced is what I identified as an outright lie, just saying that this is how he thinks logic functions. Which I guess you could look at that, instead of saying it's an outright lie, you could excuse it and say, well, that's just how Craig thinks it works. It's not how it works, but that's just Craig's way of looking at it. And if that's the case, then Craig should have made an effort to really say, this isn't how logic really functions, it's just how I think that logic could function or should function. But that's not what happens. So we have to be skeptical at least about that part of it. So I think that we should, for Craig's benefit, take this out of the equation for now. It's one thing that he said that we object to because it's not true. It's not related to the entire argument as yet. So, unless it becomes evident as I start analyzing the rest of this video that this fallacy is repeated, if he makes it again, then it's going to come back in. Otherwise, it's going to stay out for now. I'm going to leave it out. He's going to start at 0 for the next video. But if he does it again, then he's going to get +1, so it will come back to haunt him. This is one of those videos where I don't get to end it with how I usually end videos because it's not an analysis. So saying the thing that I say wouldn't make sense, so I have to end it in a different way. And why is it I keep explaining this to you people? You already know that when I have a video where I don't know how to end it, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to offer that explanation that I don't know how to end it. And it's just, I don't know if it's funny to some of you or if it's annoying at this point. I don't know. The only thing I do know is that people get irritated when Deconverted Man is like really loud, and then I have to make it quiet or get rid of it or do something different. And it's just like, I don't know. Anyways, so unless and until Rictus Gate is Kizzume, we must continue to have homosexual feelings towards him. No? That didn't work? That didn't even get close to working as far as an argument. Wow. I'm gonna have to go to the board for this. Hold on. Yeah, I see what my mistake was. I didn't begin with lobsters exist. Okay, so premise 1, lobsters exist. Premise 2, Rictus Gate is not a lobster. And premise 3 is that Kizzume is a homosexual. Therefore, Rictus Gate is a lobster that's a homosexual. Not that there's anything wrong with that.